Hi, welcome to EM Weekly. This is Todd DeVoe, your host, and I am here with the author of the Brushfire Plague series, and is R.P. Reggio. And R.P. Started off with writing the first book was the Brushfire Plague, which I read, it seems like a decade ago, but it was only a couple years ago. And then I followed up with the Brushfire Plague Reckoning, and then the final portion of this trilogy is the Brushfire Plague Retribution. You know, I got to read these books, really excited about them, and so I'm really happy to have RP here with us today. So, RP, can you introduce yourself really quick and just tell me a little bit about your background and I guess why you wrote the Brushfire Plague?
Yeah, again, this is RP Reggio. Happy to be on the show. Appreciate the time with you. Yeah, I just think, some of my background that's relevant, to the Brushfire Plague trilogy is I spent a lot of time working with people under high-stress environments, and that really has served me well, because a lot of what I get into with the Brushfire Plague trilogy is, what happens to people in a survival situation. The Brushfire Plague is a pandemic scenario. It really follows kind of the weeks and then into the first few months after a really deadly plague breaks out. So within that, people are under enormous stress and dealing with chaos, and so I do get into a lot with how that plays out, the dynamics between people, what's happened sort of with individuals sort of inside their own heads a little bit, and I carried some of my background in dealing with those kind of situations, or I should say similar situations, in writing the Brushfire Plague trilogy.
So, your hero, Cooper, he was kind of thrust into the leadership role with this little group of people that survived the initial plague. I don't want to give too much away. I know I wrote. It's funny. I read the first book, and my son was 11 when I first started reading the book, so it kind of hit me home a little bit with having that aged son in there. And Cooper's son in the book is 11 years old, and kind of him dealing with the loss of his mom. Cooper trying to go through all that. It was really a dynamic that I really thought was kind of interesting, and the fact that people kind of looked to him for leadership. When you were writing Cooper, did you know that was going to happen as far as his leadership role? Is that what you wanted to do with that character, or is that just something that sort of developed through your process?
Yeah, I would say I definitely I knew it was going to be central to the story of really taking this sort of everyman character, if you will. He's a traveling salesman before this all breaks out. I knew that was going to be a central part of the story, was how he was going to deal with what was to come, how he was going to sort of bring his neighbors together to, deal with all the chaos and violence. I knew that was going to be central. I definitely would say, like with any kind of writing process, where exactly that went, went different places than I would say I originally envisioned. Particularly, you're talking about the father-son relationship. I definitely have boys that were similar age to Jake, Cooper's son's character. And, that definitely went a lot deeper than I thought it would, initially. And I think people, who dive into the trilogy will see that over the evolution of the three books. I get a lot of comments from readers. Those are some of the most intense scenes, are what the son's dealing with, and how Cooper as the father is trying to, hold on to some of his humanity and innocence. There's some of the, people feel some of those are the best scenes in the trilogy. But yeah, that definitely went a lot, deeper than I originally envisioned. And it really just, again, within, I think, any kind of good writing, that's what happens. You kind of go in with a set where the story's going to go, the plot's going to go, where the characters are going to go. But then it sort of takes on a life of its own. And so, yeah, Jake became much more of a central character, to the whole story than I think certainly than I originally envisioned he would be. And it just, was the evolution of that writing process and as the story sort of went forward. So, yeah, there was a lot of interesting stuff that played out there. But coming back to your core question, Cooper definitely I saw him in that role going in.
So, obviously, the leadership that Cooper was showing was really important to the story. And I just want to kind of get your take on just leadership in general, because, obviously with EM Weekly, we're dealing on emergency stuff, and also leadership of running emergencies and disasters. And I think that, the people that listen to this podcast today and the students that I have that are going to listen to this podcast can take some core leadership values from Cooper. How did you, like, the big thing with Cooper is that he does not have the ability a lot, which I thought was a really interesting character trait that he gave. I mean, and he struggles with this throughout the book, the series, his ability or inability to lie. You know, and so he really had to look at some scenarios in his own life. I mean, obviously everything that's going on, but he struggled with that, and which made his leadership really kind of interesting because he couldn't just go and do what he wanted to do. He really had to get collaboration with everybody in his group. How does that work out, do you think, for people in the real world?
Yeah, I think his inability to lie, again, as you know, since you've read them, is again based on some pretty deeply impactful stuff that happened in his childhood, and it definitely is a very interesting trait to give him, and made in some cases figuring out how to write the story actually much more challenging. How to maintain some suspense where he's not able to tell an untruth. But yeah, so I think there's a lot. I mean, leadership's a big question. I think some of the stuff I focus on with Cooper that I think does generally apply is, I think first and foremost, the new word for it is emotional intelligence, but it really is just, you have to be able to pay attention to what's going on around you. Where are people at? Not necessarily even just what they're saying, but reading people, in terms of, where their emotional state is, I think is a critical, leadership trait. And again, you see that play out in the Brushfire Plague. And he does pay attention to people around him, tries to lift people up when he needs to. Other times you just gotta get people in motion and drive them. But it's interesting, over the last 10 years, I mean, the most successful leaders in any field, now the research says it's people with high emotional intelligence, which is a fancy phrase, but it really just means, again, being able to read people around you. That's how I think about that. So I think that's one. I think, again, with high stress, you have to be the rock in the storm. I think people probably already know that one, but I think you see Cooper having to do that. He's not running around with his hair on fire. He definitely, as a character, has, some anger moments, but in general, he is, I think you have to be that calm amidst the storm, I think is really critical. Another one is, how do you focus people on what you're trying to accomplish? Sometimes you just give someone a small task just to almost distract them from going into panic state, right? But more than that, it's how do you keep people focused on, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, you've got this task, I've got that task. I think that's another critical part of leadership, particularly within, crisis situations. So those are, a couple of the three that I think jump out, that I think are important across the board, that play out within the Brushfire Plague, trilogy in various ways.
Pretty interesting. So, right now let's take a break and, we'll come back when we hear a word from our sponsors.
315 and 314, there is at least one person that's been shot. Somebody is still shooting inside.
453, I have a party shot here. I need rescue hot.
Are you ready for the unthinkable? Call our friends at High Speed TACMed. They provide custom emergency planning and training that saves lives. With years of experience in law enforcement, search and rescue, responding to and managing large-scale incidents, HSTM will evaluate and prepare written plans, training sessions, drills, and debriefs, leaving you with the necessary tools and experience that can save lives. Call HSTM today to discuss your specific needs, and the staff of High Speed TACMed will help ensure that you're ready and are in complete compliance. Call High Speed TACMed today, 805-419-0024. Again, that's 805-419-0024. The friendly staff at HSTM is standing by.
Bringing out bodies now. Get someone to the back as soon as you can. Rescue personnel. I got at least 3 to 7 hits.
Are you on Instagram? Be sure to check out EM Weekly's weekly contest for a monthly prize. This month's sponsor is Voodoo Tactical. Visit emweekly.com and check out the hashtag EMWeekly contest for all the details. And now, back to EM Weekly with Todd DeVoe.
What I find kind of interesting too is how you were able to mix up the characters in the book through the series. You have people that were like Cooper's best friend, who was the prepper guy, the guy who had the, for lack of a better term, the bunker in the basement with all the stuff. And then he had people around him that had no clue what to do, and he had to actually pull them up from the bootstraps. Especially in the first book, where there was a lot of conflict between those that were prepared and those that weren't. Is that something that you see? And I know a lot of people that are going to be listening to this podcast as well are CERT members, community emergency response team members. I have students that are in my university that will be listening to this, and my community college that will be listening to this as well. I kind of want to just delve into this a little bit. So, why did you? Let's just say why. How did you decide to have groups of people that weren't ready, those that were? When you're doing those conflicts, especially in the first book. How did that develop for you? And did you pull from experience or from things that you think might happen?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for it. I mean, number one, what I wanted to do with the Breathfire Plague, the first book, and then obviously it turned into a trilogy, was, one of my motivations was, just telling a good story. That was first and foremost. There's sort of woven into that is sort of some of the preparation stuff, the survival stuff, but I did not want to write a survivalist manual dressed up as a novel, right? I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to have a good novel that had some of those other things woven into it. And I think, from that, it's like, I think what you're talking about, yes, is real life, right? So, that's just reality. Like, you're gonna, if you are thrust into a survival type situation, you're gonna have to deal mostly with people who have no idea what's going on, are totally not prepared for it. And just even at a psychological level, and that's what I tried to explore definitely in the first one, is that there's just a whole psychological coming to grips with reality that plays out in any emergency or survival type situation. And I think people are, probably familiar with that. So, yes, I think it's just about trying to describe reality. And I think that the third thing I would say is that, and this gets into a lot of other questions, not just this one, but within the genre of sort of the survivalist kind of, or prepper type fiction, that Breathfire Plague kind of lives in, there's so much, I think there's way too much focus on gear and not enough focus on sort of what I call the soft skills, which is, this issue of how do you deal with crowds of people, right? That he deals with, neighbors are assembling in front of his house. How do you deal with people that are ill prepared? Those dynamics. We were just talking about leadership questions. So that I really wanted to go focus much more on these kinds of issues. So that fed into this as well. That again, it's just realistic. I think people need to be thinking about those things in advance and developing, again, what people call those soft skills. Leadership, dealing with people. How to manage dynamics, how to keep morale up. I mean, all those sets of questions that I think often don't get enough attention. But again, I would say the root of it all is if you're going to have a good novel and some, hopefully quality writing, you've got to really have that tension and drama, and you've got to have that reality. So one thing, again, I think people will see is, the characters in there, they change and evolve. They're not the cardboard cutouts. And that's real life. That's, I think, good fiction that has all those things happening.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's funny because I like the genre, obviously. I read a few of the books that are out there. Some are good, and some are really poorly done. But this definitely falls in the set of books I really, really enjoy. I have my set, and I know somebody asked me to borrow them, and I'm almost reluctant to give them to them, but afraid I won't get them back.
Well, thank you.
It's funny though, but if you take a look at some real emergencies or real disasters that have occurred in the last 10 years, I suppose, maybe 15 years. It started with Katrina. You look at Superstorm Sandy that came in. And I remember my wife and I were watching Sandy. She asked me one day, obviously I live in earthquake country, and I have my earthquake prepared and stuff, and we have some food and water, and sometimes she thinks it's a little bit much, and then when we're watching Sandy, we're watching people going through discarded food from the delis and stuff, and the trash cans, and having food. I looked at her and said, this is why we're prepared for this type of event, And I think you did a really good job of capturing those people that were not prepared for anything, and kind of putting together those that are. I actually, his name is escaping me right now. I love his his buddy who's a ham operator and has the
that's Dranko.
Dranko, yeah, I kept on calling him Dak. I know it was that Dranko, yeah. He was such a fun character, throughout the entire book, and he seemed to be, I don't want to say counter, that's not the word, like maybe like a balance to Cooper, because he sort of had that, not that Cooper didn't, but he had like that more of a worldly kind of like hard edge to him, like where he's like, yeah, brother, this is the way it is. This is what we got to do. We have to make a hard decision. Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely was intentional. There's a lot of play there. So Cooper is more of an optimistic kind of person. Dranko is like your, dyed-in-the-wool pessimist. Cooper was not any sort of prepared person, right? And,
right.
His good friend Paul Dranko, again, he was very well prepared and was a, prepper basically. So, there was a lot of I wanted to have a lot of those tensions in there, and I think there's a lot of humor between the two of them as well. But again, it's, that feeds into both a way to have, some good dramatic tension going on, but also have good lessons emerging between the two of them going back and forth from both sides, right? But yeah, that was a really interesting dynamic. And it's interesting you bring up Katrina, because that's when I sort of, started on my preparedness sort of journey, if you will, was after Katrina. Because up until that moment, I think I was like, most Americans who would feel like, well, if something really bad happens, there'll be people coming to help us out. And we saw in that moment that you can't always depend on that, in a natural disaster situation. So that was really what started me on that journey. So, and, my kids were really small at that point. But I remember thinking like, look, I don't ever want to be in that situation. And, more than that, I just have a responsibility as a father to make sure that, that I'm at least prepared if some bad stuff happens, not just for me and my wife, but also my two very young kids. So, yeah, so that definitely was a moment for me and, got me on a different path.
Yeah, it definitely, me too, as far as that goes. I remember with Katrina, I was working in LA County in EMS, and we sent a bunch of people out there, and half the stuff that got on the news, not even half the stuff, but there was a bunch of stuff that didn't even make the news that opened my eyes, specifically of how hospitals were closed and just wouldn't take people if you weren't sick enough, And they're saying, hey, just come back if you get more sick, but we just can't take you right now, So it's definitely shows that we do have a fragile system here for sure, and that needs work, And I think that's one of the things that people, general public, sometimes don't really understand, that our system is just one disaster away from being overwhelmed completely.
Mm-hmm.
Even here in LA County and in Orange County in California. I know that we see these with the hurricanes and stuff like that, but we're definitely in a fragile situation at times, especially with some of the economics that are happening. And a little tangent here, that we have in LA County and Orange County, we have hospitals that were closed or that are closing because they just can't afford to stay open anymore. And so less and less emergency rooms and those facilities are available. So we can get overwhelmed pretty quickly. We have been, actually, with some of our flu outbreaks that we've had. So yeah, some of this stuff that's in these books that people think is far-fetched is not as far-fetched as they really think.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's, one of the things that sort of, I think, led me into writing this trilogy was, growing up, I've always read apocalyptic fiction, always been fascinated with it. And a lot of it, though, focused on sort of, after the collapse. And I've always been interested in, how does stuff sort of unravel? And so that was definitely another focus for me writing the Brushfire Plague trilogy was, the first book really just focused on the first couple weeks. And then by the time you get to to finish the next two, you're probably about 3-4 months out. I mean, so that was an area of focus for me. And I absolutely agree with, I think most people are unaware of how, the system is built for normal times. It is not built for, large amounts of people who are needing help, or, other services getting disrupted. So, and I think I tried to show at least pieces of that, in Brushfire Plague.
I did see that. I thought it was kind of funny. This is my favorite part about I guess it's my favorite part. One of the things that makes me chuckle with it, because I am addicted to coffee, for sure. And I just love the fact that was like a running thing going on. Like when there was like real coffee to be had, everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, it's coffee! Woohoo!" You know, I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm right there with you guys, man. If my coffee goes away, I'm gonna be really bummed out for a long time." I'm gonna give a little bit away in the third book. I like when they get back to Portland and there's like people there that were hoarding coffee or whatever, and they said, "Hey, if you ever want to save the world or get everything back to normal again, become the ruler of the United States, is figure out a way to get a shipment of coffee from Colombia up here." I think you're so right.
Well, and I know that's not true everywhere in the country, but it's absolutely true in Portland. I mean, I don't live there any longer, but coffee is a pretty good unifier, and would definitely wield a lot of power in that. And I mean, you're calling out. I mean, the other thing that I hope kind of people experience reading Brushfire Plague is, you know, I try to have a lot of humor as well in it that I feel like often gets lost in this genre. You know, so much of it seems like very serious, and obviously there's a lot in my books that are, but you know, that's another part of, again, A, good story, good fiction, but B, just real life, that even in very dark times, crisis moments, not everyone loses their sense of humor, and in fact, you know, maintaining a sense of humor is an important part of helping people get through the stress. So there's a lot of jokes written through. A lot of it is between Dranko and Cooper because of their relationship. But I tried to, again, reflect that reality that is real, but it's also important when people are going through a crisis situation.
Now, a couple things in there that I found kind of interesting. I told my wife when I was reading the book, "What is that book about?" And I kept telling her, "Oh, it's a love story." She's like, "Love story?" She's like, "What are you doing?" You know, and I explained to her what the story's about. She goes, "Where's our love story in there?" I said, "Well, there is kind of like a love triangle going on, you know," and I explained it to her. She's like, "Oh, you're crazy," you know. But I think it's funny how you're able to add that in there, those emotions that everybody sort of has, and just because the crisis is going on, there is still that connection that people have. And then you could also call this a coming of age story too, you know, in the likes of like things like Stand By Me or whatever, where you have this young child when it starts off, and then by the end of the series, he has no adolescence. You know, it just kind of goes away. And I found that an interesting concept. I mean, obviously, adolescence is a fairly modern concept.
Mm-hmm.
Probably since probably the late 1900s or the mid 1900s, or 1920s or so. You know, and we're used to it growing up with adolescence. And Cooper's son didn't have the ability to go through the adolescence. He went from, you know, a young boy to man almost. It was in a matter of months. You know, and how was that? You know, those two things, like putting a love story involved in the middle of this, and then also having a coming of age with Cooper's son. How did that play out with your writing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, with the romantic triangle, I have to say, you know, that was something my wife was not too pleased with. She was like, the wife just, you know, what's going on here? And I'm like, well, you know, I think it is reality, high stress situations. These are real characters that are interacting. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, there was a part of it, it's also, again, fits into having a good story that has, you know, different elements to it, you know. And so, yeah, that thread sort of plays out between the three books. And I think it's, you know, I mean, honestly, what that is the sort of tension or, you know, war going on with Cooper is a sort of a woman he has, you know, lots of physical attraction with versus someone who's probably more of a fit personality-wise, is a little more practical. And there's just that playing out, that tension. And I won't give away where it ends, but I think it ends pretty well. And then, you know, the father-son thing, again, like, that, like I was saying earlier, like, that really went a lot deeper than I thought it was. But again, it just, as a writer, as I just contemplated, you know, what would being in this world, you know, have this effect on this particular character? You know, his name is Jake, you know, 11, and sort of has his 12th birthday in the middle of all this. So he's a pretty young guy. And, you know, I've did a lot of background research on the effects of violence and stuff like that on both adults and adolescents as part of the process. And so, you know, that's really where it came from. And so there is this long running, you know, again, tension, you know, situation, where, you know, really Jake's kind of bouncing up and down between being an actual kid and, you know, depression, withdrawal, anxiety, and Cooper's trying to, you know, and also just becoming cold, right? And, you know, almost like losing his humanity, really. And then Cooper as a father, you know, he's bouncing around between, like, despair about how to, you know, help, his own sort of depression, and then moments of hope where he thinks he's able to, lift them back up and pull them back onto the sort of having humanity, not losing emotions and the ability to emotionally connect. So, and I, that was, again, really did take a life of its own. But again, I think, if people read through the trilogy, I also kind of like where that all ends, with Jake. But, those are some of the elements that were going on in terms of those different dynamics. And like I was saying earlier too, and I've heard this isn't just me as the writer, I would say the most consistent feedback I get from readers, really there's two. One is about the father-son, how that hit people. And that's usually coming from fathers, but not always. That people, that's just the feedback I get on email or some of the reviews online is, just like that relationship kind of hit people. The second one I get, which also makes me happy, is ones from people who said, I never thought about preparing for anything, but now I'm going to the store to buy some canned beans and water,
right.
Because that's also part of one of my other motivations for writing this, is give people an entree into this world that, I went into after Katrina. I think it actually is a good book to give that friend, relative, etc., that says, thinks you're crazy for doing any kind of preparedness. It's a good vehicle to get people to see, I see how something like this could actually happen. But anyway, I get a lot of feedback on the father-son relationship. That's a very, and that makes you feel good as a writer. The term for it is emotional engagement. So when you get those kind of moments of feedback, you're like, oh, that's great. I hit someone in the gut. This hit somebody in the heart. And that's, you love it as a writer, and it's pretty awesome.
Hey, I know one thing about with Dranko, and I thought that what you did well with him was that he was definitely somebody who was well ahead of the curve as far as the preparedness side. And, it sounds bad that I'm saying this, but, the term prepper now has become kind of like a bad word, I suppose. He was a guy who was prepared for anything, but it didn't consume his life. It wasn't like the only thing he did. So, and I think that's that balance that most people are looking for. But yeah, I did a good job with that.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, the Dranko character is actually based on a friend of mine. We've been friends since like 8th grade. It's not exactly him, obviously, but there's a lot of him in it. And, he's one of the really interesting characters. And, I think again, as people see it, Cooper changes, Jake changes, Dranko changes. There's another character in there, Calvin, who starts out really as kind of a bit player and really kind of rises in prominence as the books go on, and he changes. So there's a lot of that going on of which again is real life. It's good fiction, makes for a good story, but it's also just real life. People aren't static. But, Dranko, no question, is one of my favorite characters in the trilogy. And just, again, I think, Cooper and him have just a lot of great, back and forth where they're learning from each other, arguing with each other. And again, real life, so.
Yeah. It's funny, you talk about Calvin, and in my head, he looked, I guess I read books and kind of give people their own physical characteristics. And he reminded me of this farmhand that worked for this place where my grandmother, she had Alzheimer's. When we put her in a home that was like on a farm, literally on a farm. And there was this guy that worked there, and he was a Korean War vet. And when I was a kid, I loved talking to him. And I automatically attached Calvin, him to Calvin's personality and stuff like that. I don't know what it was, but about that, but Calvin was definitely a good moral compass, I suppose, for both Dranko and also for yeah. Okay, I have one more question for you regarding some character building. And all right, so you introduced this guy in I think it was the third book, maybe. The guy who grew up in Seattle area or whatever, but he kind of talked a little bit the British accent.
Yes.
Okay, so why that?
It's funny. I think my wife reading it hated that character. So, part of what happens is, and again, you saw this since you read the whole trilogy, is, some of the, there's these side characters, who are kind of, have quirky personality traits, and some of them die off. So honestly, it was my attempt to bring in another quirky character in, plays an important part in the story, but the whole, he has sort of the mock, English accent. He's a complete Anglophile. It was really just to add some more color, to that last, the end of the trilogy. But, again, some people like him, some people, he drives them crazy with the way he talks. And my wife was in the latter category. She's like, this guy drives me crazy the way he talks. And I was like, well, that's sort of the point. Like, part of, writing is, you're not supposed to actually like every single character. It's okay if some of them, drive you crazy. Because it means it's at least still hitting you some way, right? There's that emotion, right? Which is what you want as a writer. But that was it. It was really just that. I don't know if you remember the woman from, the elderly woman from Kentucky in Brushfire Plague, the first one, Lily, who is quite the hoot, and anyway, so it was just sort of in that vein of adding some more, hopefully a little bit of humor, a little bit of color to the book.
Yeah, in my head, I had him dressed like Montgomery in World War II. I don't know why, but every time I read him, that was the outfit that I pictured him in. I don't know. It was just kind of.
Well, that's the beauty of book versus film, is you get to do all that stuff. You get to create what they look like a lot in your own head, and so yeah.
That's awesome. Oh man, this is a really good trilogy. I mean, it's a fun read. It really is. If you like intense, like thriller type books, and if you like the End of the World as We Know It type of books, you can't go wrong with this trilogy at all, and I highly recommend it. Number one, is there anything else in the pipeline for you?
I'm trying to figure out where to go next. I've thought about sort of picking up the series, maybe set into the future 5 or 6 years, and really focusing on Jake as a central character, because he'd be in that 17, 18-year-old range by then. I think, and I've thought it would be really interesting to explore what the Brushfire Plague world looks like, 5, 6 years out. There's a lot that happens even just in the first few months. So that's probably the biggest thing I'm thinking about. I've also thought about sort of the nonfiction side of doing sort of some work on what does leadership in a survivalist types of an apocalyptic scenario look like. So those are the two main things bouncing around that I'll probably dive into one of those two things next.
That's awesome. Okay, 2. How can people get a hold of you and buy your books?
Yeah, and I want to thank you all for calling out the action-packed side of this whole thing. We haven't really talked much about that, but I'll just share quickly. One of my favorite email reviews I got, is actually somebody I know, who's a brutally honest kind of person. So he emails me and he says, I don't usually read fiction. I've never read this genre. The characters are not people I would normally be sympathetic to, but after the first 5 pages, I didn't want to put it down. And that's pretty much a verbatim quote, and that's always my favorite review, because it's my most hostile reader. And, so there is I think, thanks for calling that out there. I think most people say this is pretty action-packed, and it's definitely fast-moving. So, with that, where people can pick it up, it's really best places are going to be Amazon.com. It's available in paperback or Kindle. And then it's also on VN.com, which is for Barnes & Noble. You can get it on the Nook Reader as well as paperback there if you prefer dealing with them. If you want to get more background on the series, again, obviously on Amazon, there's a ton of reader reviews. But also you can always go to brushfireplague.com and bounce around there. There's more background and stuff like that. So hope that's helpful.
I think so. And one last question for you. Okay, you ready for this one?
I'm ready.
All right. So, who is your favorite character in your book? I know it's a hard one.
Oh, my favorite character. Oh, that is a hard one. I'll probably, I'm going to say, I'll give 2 answers. So, my favorite character who's through all 3 is actually Dranko. It's probably because in some ways, opposite my own personality, right? The pessimistic side, all that. But I also just like the way he changes and evolves. And then probably my favorite character, though, isn't in all 3, is that first, the character I was just talking about, the elderly woman, just because she's so sassy. I think adds a ton of humor to the first one. she's like that mythical, elderly neighbor I sort of wished I had at some point, who just is, wit as sharp as a razor blade. So that's probably my favorite character who's not quite in all three of them. But that is a hard question. I like it. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that one before. That's a great question.
Yeah, I know. I was talking to another friend of mine who's a writer, and I'd always ask her the same question. She goes, "It's like trying to choose your children." I'm like, I understand because you develop them, but that's cool. So thank you so much for being here today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or tell the listeners on this?
Well, one, it sounds from your audience, I just want to thank everybody that's ever going to listen to us for their service and dedication to our communities, or soon to be, if it sounds like some of them are in school. So I want to say that for sure. And, for anyone who does dive into the trilogy, I hope you enjoy it. And I want to thank you for having me on today. This has been a lot of fun, actually, so I appreciate it.
No problem. All right. You have a great day.
You too.
And that concludes this episode of EM Weekly. Be sure to visit us next week. Todd DeVoe and Steve Detweiler talk about where EM is headed. Thanks for listening, and be sure to visit us at emweekly.com.